Cocaine Guys. Now, before we get into this one, I must do a quick disclaimer. The Guys video series is all about fun, and this video will hopefully be fun, but at the same time, we're not trying to make light of substance abuse. So stay away from the stuff, because
when you use drugs or alcohol, especially drugs, you always lose.
Although it's weird, because this team is possibly the best Guys roster ever assembled. This reminds me of one of my favorite baseball YouTube videos, John Boy's Lonnie Smith video. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you do so now, but then come back here. Boys does a deep dive about the career of Lonnie Smith and talks about how in 1982, he would do cocaine every day with Keith Hernandez and Joaquin Andujar. He does a very funny bit where he says that since these three were doing so much cocaine, they must not have been very good, right? Well, no, they were actually the three best players on the team. Then it must not have been a very good team. Nope, won the World Series. And he comes to the unfortunate conclusion that maybe cocaine makes you awesome at baseball. Either that, or it's just that pretty much everyone was on cocaine back then, including guys who happened to be awesome at baseball. Anyway, even though we're having fun here, please don't do it! Catcher, Darrell Porter. Glasses guy Darrell Porter developed a drug problem in the 70s while playing for the Royals.
Darrell Porter's got a problem right here, I think, folks.
At one point, Porter's morning routine was to, quote, get up and make coffee, do a Quaalude, drink beer, sniff cocaine, and smoke cigarettes. He was using a gram a day during the 1979 season when he put up these numbers. The 5th best season by WAR ever for a catcher. But imagine what he'd done if he'd been clean, right? Maybe it would have been the best ever catcher season, right? I wish I could make that case, but unfortunately, Porter went to rehab after this season and was never anywhere near as good for the rest of his career. So mark 1 point for the cocaine makes you awesome at baseball column. Obviously, guys have terrific outlier seasons all the time, whether sober or not. And guys age, especially catchers. Oh, and when Porter got clean, he also became a born-again Christian. So maybe Jesus makes you bad at baseball. You ever think of that? Stop blaming everything on the cocaine. Porter was inspired to check himself into a rehab after a nightmarish offseason in '79, where he spent the whole winter coked up in a paranoid state, convinced that Commissioner Bowie Q knew about his drug use and was going to show up at his house at any moment to tell him he was banned from baseball. Porter would sit for hours staring out the window, armed with a shotgun and a bunch of billiard balls for some reason, ready to take down the commish. This is all very classic cocaine narrative, isn't it? The early good times turning to addiction and eventually leading to paranoid delusions. This is Porter's jump into the fire sequence from Goodfellas. Anyway, Porter got clean, found Jesus, and it's not like he wasn't good anymore. He was definitely still a very good catcher for the remainder of his career. But now comes the sad part. In 2002, Porter died after a relapse. Medical examiners found cocaine in his system and determined his cause of death to be excited delirium, a controversial term that is no longer used in many states today due to it being overly broadly used in fatal incidents involving police restraint. Porter was 50 years old. First base, Keith Hernandez. We go from that heaviness to a guy who occasionally makes light of his past drug use during Mets broadcasts.
A junior suite, you had a couch, a table, a little bit more space. That's all I needed.
What'd you do with the table? Did you host a dinner party in your room?
No. No. Don't ask.
Keith was famously one of the many players to testify during the Pittsburgh drug trials in 1985 in exchange for immunity. Much of this team will be made up of guys implicated in those notorious Pittsburgh drug trials. This was the trial of Curtis Strong, a caterer for the Philadelphia Phillies who became a dealer to much of MLB, and it turned into an expose on the league's drug problems. Keith was famously traded to the Mets mid-season of 1983, with the Cardinals receiving 2 mediocre pitchers. Most people think that this was due to Keith's coke habit, but it's not totally clear that that's the case. Whitey Herzog has never admitted this, and you wouldn't expect him to, but Whitey's official reason was that Keith spent too much time smoking cigarettes and doing crossword puzzles in the clubhouse. That clearly sounds like bullshit, unless doing crossword puzzles is a euphemism for doing cocaine. So I can see why people would conclude it was Keith's drug use, which would become common knowledge soon after. But Whitey clashed with Keith from the moment he took over the club in 1980. He allegedly tried to deal him at every winter meeting between 1980 and 1983. Whitey said he initially offered Keith to the Cubs in the Bruce Sutter trade, but was turned down, with the Cubs taking Leon Durham instead. Prior to the Mets trade, there were rumors of Keith being dealt to Houston for Ray Knight and Vern Rule, a much better return. In this memoir Keith wrote, If at First, he talks about how he undermined this trade by sending word through an intermediary to the Astros GM that he didn't want to play in Houston and would leave as soon as his option was up. This could explain why Herzog took a not-so-great deal, shipping Keith off to the lowly Mets, considered baseball Siberia in 1983. Herzog was no stranger to cocaine use by his teams, as he oversaw the late 70s Royals and the early 80s Cardinals, two teams saturated with coke. He wasn't exactly a pearl clutcher, but he definitely wasn't cool with the trend. Whitey was quoted in this article saying that he thought cocaine cost him a world championship in Kansas City. Could be, but come on, Whitey. The powder giveth and the powder taketh away. That 82 Cardinals club was one of the most notoriously coked up teams in history, and they got you your only championship. So, did Whitey ship off Keith because of his drug use? Maybe. But Keith and Whitey have both always denied this as the reason. Whitey even said that he thought Hernandez was off cocaine by the time of the trade, which maybe explains why Keith's numbers were so down in early 1983. And that begs the question, was Keith actually traded for not using cocaine? The main reason why this is a widely held belief today is that Ken Moffitt, the former executive director of the Players Association, said publicly in 1983 that Lonnie Smith's entry into a rehab facility and the trades of Hernandez and reliever Doug Berra were part of a cocaine purge. Moffitt would retract his statement and issue an apology because Keith threatened to sue for libel, saying,
"No, I was not doing cocaine!"
But Doug Berra also threatened to sue, and no evidence ever came to light about Berra using cocaine. And the Cardinals would trade to get him back just 2 years later, which seems weird. Why would you ship a guy out for such a scandalous reason and then bring him right back? In Keith's memoir, he brings up a lot of the inconsistencies with the theory of him being traded for this reason. First off, it was widely known that Joaquin Andujar was using, but Whitey didn't trade him. The Cardinals were short on pitching, and Andujar was Whitey's guy, who he had traded for and developed into a star. He also brings up the notion that Whitey was actually seeking Neil Allen and not trying to get rid of Hernandez. Frank Cashin allegedly told Keith that Whitey offered up a number of other players first before offering Keith. This does track, as Whitey had previously tried to acquire Neil Allen, along with pitcher Tim Leary and infielder Doug Flynn, for Hernandez back in 1980, but Cashin had turned him down. Also, Whitey Herzog was quoted in 1985 as saying there were 11 players on the early 80s Cardinals that he knew were using. Again, he didn't trade all of those guys. Although we'll come back to this later on in the video. So was it part of the reason Keith was dealt? Maybe. Would he have been traded had he been batting .330? Maybe not. But I actually do think it had more to do with Keith's attitude and sluggish 83 stats, and the Cards' need for pitching. So yeah, it was because he was doing too many crosswords. Back to his memoir, which I do not recommend reading. This book is a real slog to get through. It's basically a diary of the 1985 season, recapping all 162 games and talking about a lot of the quotidian aspects of a baseball player's life. It has interesting parts, but the writing is less than compelling. The only parts where it truly sings are when he writes about his cocaine use and the Pittsburgh drug trials. This is unreliable narrator territory for sure, but it is pretty interesting because Keith regrets much of what he said on the stand. He says that once he got up there, he felt the strong urge to self-flagellate. He said on the stand that cocaine was like a demon in him. But afterwards, he was like, why did I say that? I don't believe that. He downplays his cocaine use, again, unreliable narrator, saying that basically everyone in America was using cocaine at that time. It wasn't something specific to baseball, but ball players were in the limelight, so they had to be the scapegoats. I mean, it's a bit rich to say that when most normal people busted for cocaine would much prefer a little bad publicity instead of jail time. Second base, Alan Wiggins. Okay, back to a serious downer here. Wiggins is an extremely tragic figure. He had been arrested during his rookie season in 1982 for cocaine possession and completed a stint in rehab. He then went on to have 2 excellent seasons in 83 and 84, becoming a key part of San Diego's 84 playoff run. But he would relapse in 85 and check into rehab again. San Diego's management was furious about this and subsequently traded him away to Baltimore, where he would struggle and be out of the majors by 1987. His addiction intensified, and he turned to intravenous drug use, contracted HIV, and died of complications from AIDS in 1990 at age 32, weighing 75 pounds at the time of his death. He left behind 3 children. God damn. Okay, let's move on to third base. Paul Molitor. Molitor was not implicated in the Pittsburgh drug trials, but was interviewed by a federal investigator during the trial of Tony Peters, a drug dealer in Milwaukee. Allegedly, Molitor paid by check. It was a different time, I guess. Shortstop, Garry Templeton. Back to the early 80s Cardinals and mid-80s Padres. I hesitated putting Templeton on this roster because he's the only guy on here who, as far as I can tell, never admitted to cocaine use and never failed a drug test or faced a suspension for cocaine. The only evidence of Templeton being a cocaine guy is hearsay. One bit coming from this very entertaining article about the 1986 San Jose Bees, about an independent league team made up of a bunch of players who washed out of the majors, many due to drug abuse problems, including Steve Howe, Mike Norris, Ken Reitz, and Darryl Strawberry. Templeton was not on this team, but he's referenced by Reitz, the former Cardinals third baseman who struggled with addiction. Reitz said that Templeton introduced him to coke in 1978. The other bit of hearsay comes from Whitey Herzog, who said in this speech that
Garry Templeton got messed up on drugs, and he wasn't himself.
And there's a notion I've seen a few times that every trade Whitey Herzog made in the early 80s was to exile a coke user. Obviously ties into our segment earlier about Keith Hernandez. But this seems like a particularly specious claim. We know that Keith was a coke user, as well as Larry Sorensen, who Whitey dealt in 1981 to acquire Lonnie Smith in a 3-team trade. But that deal, by all accounts, developed due to the Cleveland Indians GM's bizarre fascination with Sorensen, an unremarkable starter. And Lonnie Smith, a tremendous player, fell into Whitey's lap. Don't think that had anything to do with Sorensen's drug use. Then this whole claim falls apart completely unless you think Whitey dealt Ted Simmons, Pete Vukovich, Terry Kennedy, and Leon Durham because they were all coked up. I mean, like Keith said, it was extremely prevalent in the early 80s, so maybe they were, but playing whack-a-mole with 80s cokeheads is no way to build a baseball team. I think Whitey was more concerned about winning games than creating a straight-edge ball club. That said, the Templeton trade could possibly have been instigated by drug use, as we saw in that Herzog speech. He talks about how Templeton was not his usual competitive self in 1981, asking for lots of days off, especially day games after night games. This all came to a head on 1981's Ladies' Day at Busch Stadium, which I guess is like a ladies' night type of promotion a bar would have. After getting booed for not hustling, Garry flipped off the fans and grabbed his crotch. Damn, Garry, on Ladies' Day? Whitey literally yanked him out of the game. And Whitey says here that he suspended Templeton initially, but the team doctor insisted they send him to a hospital with, quote, emotional problems. The day after Ladies' Day, I believe the term for that is Ladies' Morrow, Whitey said Cardinals owner Gussie Busch called telling him to cut Templeton immediately. But Whitey said to give him a chance to trade him first, which of course he did in the offseason, pulling off the legendary Ozzie Smith trade. But there's 2 sides to every story. Templeton and his agent denied any drug use, and even though doctors would say that Templeton had a serious problem with clinical depression that stemmed from childhood issues, Templeton said there had been nothing wrong with him at all. He says he went along with the hospitalization in order to avoid a suspension and get back on the field sooner. His explanation for his Ladies' Day behavior was that he was suffering from torn cartilage in his knee and sprained ligaments in his ankle, but with the Cardinals in the pennant race, Whitey had insisted they needed him in the lineup that day. Garry says Whitey told him to take it easy when possible, though. He didn't want him risking a bigger injury, so no need to run hard on a low percentage play. which is what led the fans to initially get on his case when he didn't run out a dropped third strike. According to Templeton, those boos turned into N-words, and that's what set him off. He says that Whitey and the rest of the coaching staff must have heard the slurs but did nothing to defend him and threw him under the bus. So whether his behavior on Ladies' Day stemmed from drug addiction, mental health issues, or righteous anger at racist taunts, we don't really know for sure. But we do know that it led to his ousting from St. Louis. Left field, Tim Raines. I've seen several times people online spreading the idea that Raines' nickname Rock was due to his cocaine habit. But Raines was snorting coke, not smoking crack. His nickname was due to his incredibly low 7.8 body fat percentage. But what was a true story is that he sometimes carried a gram of cocaine in his back pocket, which is why he often slid headfirst. Center field, Josh Hamilton. Okay, here's the counterpart to that notion that cocaine makes you awesome at baseball. Hamilton was a blue chip prospect drafted 1 of 1 in 1999 by the Rays. But after being injured in a car accident in 2001, Hamilton started drinking and using drugs regularly. He had his first of many failed drug tests in spring training of 2003 and would be suspended, not returning to the minors until late in 2006. He'd finally make it to the bigs with the Reds and then get dealt to Texas, where he'd become a star in 2008. But an injury-plagued 2009 would lead him to relapse at a bar in Phoenix. And it looks like he wasn't half-assing this relapse. But Hamilton would make an even more triumphant return in 2010, winning the MVP and leading the Rangers to the World Series. Hamilton had 2 more relapses during his career, once with alcohol in 2012 and once with alcohol and cocaine in 2015. His career went south in 2013 after signing a big deal with the Angels, which is kind of what happens when you sign a big deal with the Angels. Hopefully he's staying clean in a retirement which has not been super peaceful. He was arrested and indicted for allegedly beating his daughter in 2019, leading to a plea to a misdemeanor. And while we're talking about Hamilton, let's talk about his manager, who will be the manager of this team, Ron Washington. Wash is the only manager I can think of that failed a drug test. In 2009, Ron Washington used cocaine, according to him, the first and only time he did so. He was drug tested shortly afterward, but was very forthright with the Rangers in the league, who allowed him to stay on as manager. And while we're on the subject of the coaching staff, let's take another non-player for this team. We'll take the Pirate Parrot as our mascot, the only Major League mascot with a cocaine scandal section on its Wikipedia page. It came out during the Pittsburgh drug trials that Kevin Koch, the original Pirate Parrot performer, used cocaine during games and served as a middleman between dealers and players. Right field, Dave Parker. In right, we've got the Cobra, another of the key figures in the Pittsburgh drug trials. Even though most of the guys implicated in those trials went on to have decent careers afterwards, the taint remained. For years, Hall of Fame voters gave guys like Parker, Tim Raines, Keith Hernandez, and Vida Blue the same treatment they've given the steroids guys in recent years. But as much as I love Dave Parker, one of the coolest dudes in baseball history, I don't see how he had much of a Hall of Fame case to begin with, and I was surprised that he got in last year. He does have a good 7-year peak, but his 40 career WAR falls short for me. He does come fairly close to the 3,000 hit milestone at 2,712, but falls pretty short on the homer milestone at 339. He did win 2 batting titles and an MVP award, but his career is really front-loaded. Basically, once 1980 hit, Parker turned into a pumpkin. He really had just one great year after 1979, with an excellent 1985. Otherwise, his post-70s career was a slightly above-average hitter who'd lost a couple of steps in the outfield. I feel like Parker's case comes down to the old most feared hitter in the league argument. This was the case made for Jim Rice back in 2009. Rice is another player I was personally a big fan of, but who I have to admit didn't seem to me Hall of Fame worthy. Although he probably had a better case than Parker, even though he didn't crack 2,500 hits or 400 homers. The case I kept hearing back then was that he was the most feared hitter in the league in the late 70s, early 80s. I don't know why this was an argument. Like, so what? Albert Bell was probably the most feared hitter in the league for several years. Should he be in? What about Cecil Fielder in the early 90s? He was pretty scary. And also, was Rice really the most feared hitter in the league at that time? More so than Reggie Jackson or Mike Schmidt? Tim Raines was the one guy in the Pittsburgh drug trials group who really was a slam dunk Hall of Famer to me. But I find it odd that you don't hear a lot of people making a case for Keith Hernandez. I would have said that Keith was more of a Hall of Very Good guy, but when I revisit his numbers, I think he really ought to go in. Obviously, he doesn't have the classical counting stats with only 2,182 hits and only 162 homers. But comparing him to Parker, he's got a better batting average, a way better on-base percentage, and a better OPS and OPS plus, and 20 more wins above replacement in 400 fewer games. A lot of this is of course due to Keith's defense, and I think this is where his case is strengthened. He's widely considered the best defensive first baseman of all time, and the advanced stats back that up, with Keith the all-time leader in fielding runs for first baseman with 117. Because WAR has an adjustment for positional scarcity, Keith ends up with just 1.3 defensive WAR. I think Keith was a victim of his handedness in this instance. If Keith had been right-handed, I have no doubt he would have been an elite third baseman. Hell, maybe even a pretty good shortstop early in his career. This dude was making plays you just really don't see first basemen make. And if we look at third baseman with roughly 117 defensive runs saved, we see that Keith wouldn't have been anywhere near Brooks Robinson or anything, but maybe he'd be at like a Wade Boggs type level. In which case, Keith's WAR would possibly shoot up over 70. And then he's more of a slam dunk. But alas, my man was touched by the Southpaw's curse. But still, come on, put that pretty boy in the hall. DH, Derrel Strawberry. Strawberry had a long and documented struggle with addiction. Strawberry was on a Hall of Fame trajectory in his 20s. Through his age 29 season in 1991, Straw had put up 40.3 WAR with 280 homers and an 875 OPS. But over his final 8 seasons, he did this, missing lots of time due to suspensions. And it wasn't all to do with his coke problem, though. He had plenty of other distractions. And just when Darryl seemed like he'd gotten it all together with his excellent comeback season in 1998, he was diagnosed with colon cancer during the ALDS, and this led him to another relapse. He was going to play for the Yankees in 2000, but failed another drug test, which effectively ended his career. Rotation. Vida Blue. I don't know if I'd put Vida in the Hall. He had a great peak, an MVP/Cy Young season, but at just 45 WAR, he falls a bit short, although he does slightly outdo his A's rotation mate, Catfish Hunter, who was voted in. Blue was one of the 4 Kansas City Royals players who served time for cocaine charges, along with Willie Wilson, Willie Aikens, and Jerry Martin. These were just the guys who were implicated in a wiretap by the feds on their dealer, a guy named Mark Liebel. Liebel was a small business owner and baseball nut whose house in suburban Overland Park, Kansas became the hub of the Royals' cocaine problem. An endless parade of Royals players as well as visiting players would come to Liebel's house after games to do coke in his basement, which they dubbed the Cooperstown Room. I'm guessing it looked something like this, but with more baseball memorabilia on the walls.
You guys want to play baseball?
What started out as a dream for Liebel eventually turned into a nightmare, as he couldn't escape the non-stop demand from players, who often stiffed him on the deals. When police arrested him, he was actually relieved, saying, "You just don't know how glad I am this thing's finally over." Much like Curtis Strong from the Pittsburgh drug trials, Liebel does not come off as your stereotypical drug dealer. They were just 2 guys that were really excited to hang around some professional ball players. When Commissioner Bowie Kuhn went to interview Liebel in prison, he came out of it saying, "Oddly enough, Liebel is a real baseball fan. He wanted to make the players happy, so he supplied them with drugs." But he was concerned about what was going on. It was a paradoxical thing. Liebel basically didn't make a cent off of his dealings. He supplied the coke done at his house free of charge. Any coke leaving his house, he asked to be paid for, but players often said, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday." Liebel spent so much money on cocaine for the ball players that his legitimate business went under, and he lost 2 houses he had owned. This guy was basically the Ray Kinsella of cocaine, plowing under his crops in the hopes that people will come to snort coke. Liebel served 2.5 years of a 6-year sentence and would move to Hawaii, according to this obituary I found, where he would become a resort beverage director and everybody's bartender, including the rich and famous. Ferguson Jenkins. Fergie Jenkins became the first player to ever be suspended from baseball for life in 1980 after he was busted with 3 grams of cocaine by Canadian customs officials. Jenkins appealed and won, serving only 2 weeks of that suspension. This likely led to the delay of his induction into the Hall of Fame until his 3rd year of eligibility, even though he had a pretty slam dunk first ballot case. Dwight Gooden. Similar trajectory as teammate Derrel Strawberry here. Gooden famously missed the 1986 Mets parade because he was using drugs at his dealer's apartment. After a series of failed drug tests and suspensions, Gooden, like Strawberry, would make a comeback with the Yankees, putting together a very solid year and throwing a no-hitter in the Yankees' 1996 championship run. Gooden has continued to have problems with cocaine and alcohol, facing legal repercussions several times and eventually ending up in an episode of Celebrity Rehab. And there's an odd detail about Doc from his rehab roommate. It's a shame Gooden's career went the way it did. I don't know if there was ever a more exciting pitcher to watch than Dr. K in his first few seasons. And the guy was so young, 19 in that rookie year where he led the league in WAR, strikeouts, FIP, WHIP, and strikeouts per 9. And then followed that up with arguably the greatest pitching season in the history of baseball. It is the highest WAR pitcher season by Baseball Reference WAR in the live ball era, which gives it a pretty good case as the best season ever. Some dead ballers and 19th century guys outdid that, but playing with a dead ball in a non-integrated league. I'll take 1985 Doc. Joaquin Andujar. Talked about Andujar a bit already, as he was Keith Hernandez and Lonnie Smith's coke buddy and was implicated in the Pittsburgh drug trials. Andujar had a great and terrible year in 1985 for the Cardinals. He won 21 games for the 101-win Cardinals, but he was one of the 7 players in the aftermath of the scandal to receive the harshest punishment from the league. Those 7 were the ones who had been determined to be prolonged users that also facilitated distribution of the drug. And then in Game 7 of the World Series, Andujar didn't make much of an effort to rehabilitate his image as he melted down on the field, then ripped a sink out of the wall of the clubhouse at Royal Stadium. Surprisingly, through all this, Whitey Herzog was Joaquin's greatest champion. GM Dal Maxfield would ship the controversial Andujar to Oakland, but Whitey would vehemently lobby for Andujar to be re-signed as late as 1989. Andujar seemed pretty cooked after 2 bad years in 87 and 88, but Whitey told Maxfield, "We gotta have him." In the end, Maxfield overruled Whitey, and Andujar would retire after washing out of spring training with the Expos in 1989. J.R. Richard. Another tragic figure here, J.R. Richard was a strikeout artist at the height of his powers in 1980, when he had a near-fatal stroke during a workout at the Astrodome. It was speculated by some that the stroke was caused by Richard's cocaine use, as teammate Enos Cabell testified in Pittsburgh that he and Richard did cocaine regularly throughout the 1980 season. Richard's doctor denied that the drug use could have possibly been responsible for the stroke, coming to the conclusion that Richard suffered from arterial thoracic outlet syndrome. Jeff Pearlman has a great video on his YouTube channel about Richard. He talks about how the Astros and their medical staff really failed Richard, as he complained for nearly 3 weeks about arm pain, arm heaviness, ringing in his ears, dizziness, and other symptoms. According to Pearlman, the Astros told him to stop whining and pitch. The team also blamed his problems on his, quote, social life. Richard's wife told reporters it took death, or nearly death, to get an apology. They should have believed him. Richard would sue the team doctors in 1982 for negligence. But things would get even worse for Richard in retirement. He would eventually find himself living under an overpass for a time before turning his life around and eventually writing a book. Bullpen. For the pen, we'll convert a couple of starters. First off, Esteban Loaiza. Loaiza had a pretty solid 14-year MLB career, raking in over $43 million. You'd think he'd be set for life, right? Apparently not for Loaiza, who turned to distributing cocaine in his retirement, getting busted with over 20 kilos and being sentenced to 3 years in prison before being deported to Mexico in 2021. Oil Can Boyd. Putting Boyd in the bullpen here might lead to some issues, as this is the guy who, when he was passed over to start Game 7 of the '86 World Series, immediately walked down the street to a crack house and was not available out of the pen. Oil Can Boyd admitted in his autobiography that he smoked crack every day of the 1986 season. Boyd's habit was apparently an open secret in the Red Sox clubhouse. When Boyd showed up to spring training in '86 weighing just 150 pounds, Red Sox medical director Arthur Pappas put out a cover story that Boyd had suffered from a bout with hepatitis. Still, he was able to put up one of his better years in '86, despite being in this seemingly frail condition. Boyd washed out of the big leagues after 1991, but he kept playing, going to the Mexican leagues for a while, then reporting to spring training for the White Sox in '95 as a replacement player during the strike. And then, after pitching for an independent league team at age 45, he created Oil Can Boyd's Traveling All-Stars, a barnstorming team in the spirit of the Negro Leagues. Boyd's father and two of his uncles had played in the Negro Leagues, and he had a fascination with those days. In fact, he was quoted as saying he didn't have a lot of gratitude for Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier, saying, "I'm not real thankful to Jackie at all, because my style of baseball, the way I played it in the major leagues, transpired from the Negro Leagues." He felt like the flamboyant way he played baseball was more in line with the vibe of the Negro Leagues, and this didn't go over well with the button-down MLB, which marginalized and punished players like him. In his autobiography, he wrote that Jackie Robinson was a modern-day Shaka Zulu. He was the king who sold his own people into slavery. So all Jackie did was sell us to Major League Baseball the same way.
Cocaine is a hell of a drug.
Steve Howe. Howe was the second guy to receive a lifetime suspension for cocaine use, but he also appealed and won reinstatement. Howe was suspended 7 times in his career. He made several comebacks where he'd show flashes of brilliance before repeating the same mistakes. After baseball, Howe worked as a framing contractor in Arizona and died in a car accident in '06. Toxicity reports showed methamphetamine in his system. Rod Scurry. The first player directly named in the Pittsburgh drug trials, Scurry was an excellent reliever for a few early '80s Pirates teams. Scurry went on a rapid downward spiral upon the end of his baseball career. He was arrested for buying crack 2 days after he was released by Seattle in 1988. Then in 1992, police responded to a neighbor's call about Scurry, who was complaining that snakes were in his home, crawling on him and biting him. He died while being restrained by police. The cause of death was a cocaine-related heart attack. Sammy Stewart. Sammy Stewart was an excellent reliever for the early '80s Orioles, who became addicted to crack cocaine following his retirement. From 1989 to 2006, Stewart was arrested 26 times on 43 charges, including the kidnapping of his wife in 1989. In '06, he would start a 6-year sentence for felony drug charges. He came out of prison a changed man and had a redemptive final act, where he remarried and worked as a youth pitching instructor. Bench. Outfield. Lonnie Smith. Lonnie might have been cool with the Pirate Parrot, but he was most definitely not cool with the Philly Fanatic. At the height of Lonnie Smith's 5-figure-a-year coke habit in 1982, he became so irate at the antics of the Fanatic that he tackled him, spraining both of the ankles of the man in the costume. This was perhaps the start of Smith's Goodfellas jump into the fire era. The good times were ending and the paranoia and delusions were setting in. In June of '83, after a particularly rough coke-fueled night, toilet paper stuffed into his nose to prevent his ulcerated nostrils from bleeding, Smith went to Whitey Herzog and asked for help. Whitey would help get him into rehab for the next month, after which he'd play great for the rest of the year. And Smith would have a real up-and-down career through the next 10 seasons. Again, watch that John Boys video, it's great. Shortstop. Dale Berra. We get a backup shortstop with son of Yogi, Dale Berra. Dale was named after Dale Mitchell, a pinch hitter for the Dodgers who made the final out of Don Larson's perfect game in 1956. Very Yogi thing to do. I wonder what Mitchell thought of that. Berra the Younger was a highly touted prospect who went 20th overall to the Pirates in 1975, but his career never amounted to much, possibly due to his drug habit. Fittingly, his most memorable moment was this famous toot glam. His cocaine use would continue until 1992, when Yogi organized a family intervention. Enos Cabell. Cabell was one of the guys who admitted to cocaine use during the Pittsburgh drug trials. He was suspended for the 1986 season, but then the suspension was voided in exchange for community service. He played in the bigs for 15 years and was a decent player, despite the fact that Bill James in 1983 described him as a guy who, quote, can't play baseball. Now that's a bit harsh. The guy wasn't amazing, but he was totally playable, putting up 11 WAR in his career despite having negative numbers in both batting runs and fielding runs, and negative runs from positional scarcity. I guess he must have made up a lot of value by being a good base runner. WAR works in mysterious ways sometimes. James was actually more mad at Sparky Anderson for relying on Cabell so much on the early 80s Tigers, saying, "I think that's what drives me nuts about Sparky Anderson. He's so full of brown stuff." Damn, Bill, brown stuff? Whoa, geez, man.
That's right. This is family TV.
That's right, this is a family show here. Let's not be talking about brown stuff. So full of that stuff that it just doesn't seem like he has any words left over for a basic, fundamental understanding of the game. This is weird that Bill was so anti-Cabell in 1983, though, because this was Enos's best season. He slashed .311, .335, .434, and posted 3.8 WAR in just 420 plate appearances. First base, Willie Aikens. Aikens was one of the 4 Royals busted in 1983 who did time. The Royals traded him to Toronto while he was in prison, and Aikens was never able to get his career back on track. He was arrested again in 1994 for distribution of crack and received a maximum sentence of 15 years and 8 months, with 5 more years tacked on for having a gun in the room where the drugs were sold. This harsh sentencing was due to maximum mandatory sentences for crack cocaine. Aikens had sold 2.2 ounces of crack to an undercover police officer, but was charged as if he had sold 15 pounds of powder cocaine. Aikens would be released in 2008 after 14 years behind bars, when those sentencing guidelines were deemed cruel and unusual. Outfield, Jeffrey Leonard. Another guy from the Pittsburgh drug trials who was initially suspended and then had the suspension waived in exchange for a fine, community service, and drug testing for the rest of his career. Leonard was an okay slugger in the 80s who was into his decline phase in 1987 when he had an incredible NLCS. He hit 4 homers, slugged .917, and won the series MVP in a losing cause. Can't believe I left Leonard off of the nickname guys team, as he had 3 memorable nicknames. Hackman, which was spelled like Pac-Man, Flap Down because of his unique home run trot, and the very unflattering Penitentiary Face because of his tough, unsmiling demeanor. When he decided to go by Jeffrey instead of Jeff in 1987, his nickname was also changed to Correctional Facility Face. Outfield, Willie Wilson. Another of those 4 Royals arrested in 1983. Wilson's career did not suffer serious repercussions from that incident, and he would go on to have another solid decade in the bigs. Things went bad for him in retirement, though. After a series of bad investments in the late 90s, Wilson found himself on the verge of bankruptcy and also struggling with a coke problem. He went to rehab, but afterwards he did have to file for bankruptcy, necessitating the auctioning off of his sports memorabilia, including his 1985 World Series ring. He'd get his life turned around though, starting the Willie Wilson Foundation, which runs youth baseball camps. In 2014, his business partner surprised him by presenting him with his World Series ring. Well, it was a replica, but still. Utility. Derrel Thomas. Wasn't really familiar with this guy who had a 15-year big league career, who was also implicated in the Pittsburgh drug trials and ended up on that 1986 San Jose Bees team. He had the reputation as an agitator around the league, and in fact, he was kicked off of the San Jose Bees. You've got to be pretty annoying to get kicked off of a team like that. Steve Howe told the manager, "You need to get rid of him before somebody kills him." Thomas went on to a pretty rocky career coaching baseball in retirement. He bounced around from independent league teams to high school teams, and in 1991 he was coaching the Dorsey High School team when one of the players fatally shot himself on the team bus playing Russian roulette. Jeez. Then the next month, Thomas was arrested in a cocaine sting. Highly recommend this article, which details the case where undercover DEA agents provided 22 pounds of cocaine to Thomas if he could find a buyer, which he did. This guy named Ricky Ross, who was a disgraced former narcotics officer who had previously been arrested for killing 3 prostitutes. Those charges were dropped. And by the way, this Ricky Ross is not the infamous Freeway Ricky Ross, the LA drug kingpin, who incidentally attended Dorsey High School. Small world. Anyway, Thomas mainly played second, short, and center, but could play anywhere, including catcher. And we do need a backup catcher, so he'll have to do with his 6 major league games catching. All right, there we go. That's our Cocaine Guys team. I've been going on and on and on this one with no regard to other people's feelings. So it's probably time to stop this video. Please like and subscribe for more guys.
Yeah, guys.